Scotland's flagship recycling scheme took another trashing yesterday when a further lengthy delay was announced to the deposit return scheme. Holyrood and Westminster have been at loggerheads in recent weeks over the Scottish Government's plans to include glass. Earlier in the programme, we heard from Mo Razak from the Federation of Independent Retailers, which represents more than 1,000 shops across Scotland.
We are seeking legal advice on this matter. We went in with good faith. We supported the scheme and we helped with the scheme, and we worked with the scheme for over 6 years. And this wasn't down to retailers not trying and not trying to make this work. It's down to the Scottish Government not working it properly and not planning this properly.
So the Federation of Independent Retailers is actively considering suing the Scottish Government?
Yes, we are.
Well, the Minister in charge of delivering the scheme is Lorna Slater. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What do you make of what you heard there from the Federation of Independent Retailers, that they're actively considering legal action against your government?
The First Minister and I yesterday met with over 100 representatives from business, including Mo as a representative of small retailers. And the First Minister went around the room and asked people, given where we are, given the uncertainty put in place by the UK government, what is their preferred way forward? And the overwhelming response from the room, from businesses was that we align with the UK. And they knew that that means not going live until 2025 at the earliest. Because the UK haven't even passed their regulations, they don't have a scheme administrator, it's going to take them time. So the First Minister and I listened to businesses, and that was their overwhelming preference.
Is that not a meeting that should have happened 5 or 6 years ago?
As Mo said there in that clip, businesses have been working with the Scottish Government on this for 6 or 7 years. And indeed, Rishi Sunak, Alistair Jack, even Douglas Ross stood in 2019 on a manifesto to put in place a deposit return scheme that included glass. The Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, working in good faith on the knowledge that at that time, England, Wales and Scotland were all putting in place systems with glass, passed legislation to have a system with glass in it. We know that later that same year, the UK put in place this Internal Market Act, which means that they can override certain pieces of Scottish legislation.
And you knew about
Knowing
that
that
too.
Was the case,
you knew about that too.
We did.
Should you not
in
have applied
2020
for an exemption earlier?
They put in place that act in 2020 after we'd passed our regulations. In 2021, I started the process to apply for that exemption to the Internal Market Act nearly 2 years ago. The UK only took glass out of their scheme in 2022. Again, and nearly a year later. And this year, in January this year, the UK's own documentation said that it was for the devolved nations to determine the scope of their deposit return schemes. So between January this year and May, at the last possible minute, the UK has changed its mind about what Scotland can do in its scheme. Nearly 3 years after our regulations were passed, that is not acting in good faith, and that is undermining the work that you heard Mo and businesses in Scotland have done for years, the investment they've done to make this scheme work, and the UK changed their mind in the last few months to torpedo our scheme.
You told Parliament yesterday you had no other option but to delay this now until at least October 2025. But you did have another option, didn't you? You could have let the scheme go ahead without glass.
The glass is certainly one part of it. Going ahead without glass would have been difficult, but it is possible. There are a few schemes in the world that run without glass. It's not really normal to exclude glass. I mean, glass bottles not being included in a deposit return scheme is nonsense.
Let's be clear, lots of schemes start without glass.
There was only one part of the problem. That was only one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that the UK put upon us conditions that we must match up with their system. Now, they didn't say we would co-develop it. They didn't say we'll learn from the Scottish experience. What they said is they would impose their scheme on us. Now, the trick there is that they haven't passed their scheme. So, for example, our scheme and our regulations, we say that the deposit is going to be 20 pence. The UK haven't even passed their scheme. What if they say the deposit's going to be 10 pence or 30 pence? How are we supposed to get a scheme going in March when maybe in November the UK would lay regulations that would make major changes to our scheme? That's simply not possible. That puts us in an impossible position of asking Scottish businesses to comply with regulations that don't even exist yet. We can't do that.
Have you spoken to anyone at DEFRA about the sort of scheme that they're looking at? Have you had any information about that scheme?
We have no details at all about that scheme. We know that they completed their consultation earlier this year in January, but beyond what they consulted on, we have no idea what that would look like going forward. I have written to my counterparts in DEFRA on Tuesday this week to ask urgently for a meeting on the clarity about what that scheme is going to look like. Because if we are to ask Scottish businesses to align with the UK scheme in 2025, we still need to know what that looks like. We still need to know how we're going to work together on that. Okay. Now, in Scotland, we've spent years working with businesses, developing our scheme, making the adjustments we need to make it work. DEFRA haven't even started that work yet.
So what happens to Circularity Scotland now? It's the business set up to operate this scheme. It's got 2 years where presumably it doesn't do anything while it waits to see whether this scheme will go ahead?
Well, that's one of the most frustrating elements here. And Circularity Scotland, of course, are big advocates of the scheme. And Circularity Scotland, who had attracted millions of pounds of private investment toward this scheme, they've got employees going, they've got IT systems ready to go. They were ready to go for an August 16th this year launch. That was them all set ready to go. We had an operational scheme in Scotland. So they've been funded by industry. The overwhelming message from industry yesterday was that they want to align with the UK scheme, even knowing that that's unlikely to come into place until after October 2025.
So will there be job losses at Circularity Scotland?
To support. Well, Circularity Scotland is an industry body, and industry wanted, that was the ask, that we align with the UK. So now industry have to decide how they are going to support Circularity Scotland forward. So that is for a conversation between Circularity Scotland and its membership.
So the Scottish Government isn't responsible for what happens next at Circularity Scotland. The Scottish Government could be responsible, though, for paying compensation to retailers. We mentioned Mo Razak and the Federation of Independent Retailers. He says that they moved forward in good faith because the Scottish Government said they needed to spend the money to invest in this scheme in order to do business. They'd now like compensation for that. Will the Scottish Government give them compensation because it's going to cost them money over the next 2 years?
Mo and the businesses that he represents did indeed and have indeed made significant investment and supported us all the way through this in good faith, as Mo has said. The scheme will go ahead. The input from business is that they wanted to go ahead in alignment with the UK, even knowing that means a delay to the scheme. So we're listening to business and we're working towards that 2025 launch now.
But they're looking for compensation now. Mo says they've spent, he's looking at his business, but many of them are in a similar situation. £10,000 installing the machine, £4,000 a year for the contract. That's over £8,000 in the next 2 years, at least, before any other scheme could possibly start. Will they get compensation?
I mean, you can hear how much investment Scottish businesses have put in that and multiply that by the number of businesses that have done this.
Yes,
and they did that based on regulations that the Scottish Parliament passed, acting in good faith that they were doing the right thing for the environment. And the UK government has now come in and made this scheme impossible to deliver on the original timescale. So we have committed to doing what industry asks us to do, which is to align with the UK scheme, even though we don't know what that looks like yet, and at the earliest possible date that we can do that. So I thank the businesses for their investment. We are doing our absolute best to make sure that we can make good on that investment as soon as possible.
If you don't think, do you think this will happen in October 2025?
I'll be honest, I'm very, very sceptical.
When do you
From when we passed our regulations in the Scottish Parliament in 2020 to our launch date this year, which was intended to be August 16th before the UK started messing around with the Internal Market Act, that's 3 years. The UK haven't even passed their regulations yet, so that we're in mid-2023 now. That would leave them about 18 months between when they pass the regulations and when they say they'll go live. I think that's unrealistic. I'll be honest. I think I'm very skeptical of that timeline.
Couldn't all of this have been avoided if you'd worked more closely with the UK government from the very start of this and listened earlier to businesses who were warning you that glass was always going to be problematic?
Glass is really important to include in deposit return schemes. It's normal to include it in schemes. It's one of those common sense things. A bottle return scheme that doesn't include glass.
I asked if this situation could have been avoided if you'd worked with people earlier.
We have been working with people all along. You heard Mo himself say that he's been working with us on this for 6 or 7 years, and that's true of many Scottish businesses. As I said, in 2019, the UK government, current government, stood on a manifesto promise to install a deposit return scheme with glass for the UK. When we passed our regulations, that was the status quo. That was the understanding, the common understanding of all UK nations. It's England that have changed their minds. Late in the day in 2022, they changed their minds to take glass out of the scheme. It is they who are the outlier. Wales and Scotland went ahead with the original plan, which we all had back in 2020 to include glass. So England has decided they want to take glass out of their scheme, and now they're imposing that on Scotland and Wales. It is England who is the outlier here.
OK, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning, Circularity Minister Lorna Slater.
And at 9 o'clock, Stephen is looking for your views on all of this. He's with us now. Good morning.
Morning, Gary. Yeah, at 9, we're asking on the phone in this morning, are you relieved or are you frustrated that this scheme is now being delayed until at least 2025? 08085 92 95 00 or 80295. If you want to text us this morning,